Chapter 2. The ride from the courthouse to the middle school would take 15 minutes if properly done, if one obeyed the traffic laws and refrained from trespassing. And normally, this way, Theo would do things, except when he was running a bit late. He flew down Market Street the wrong way, jumped the curb just ahead of a car, and bolted through a parking lot, used every sidewalk available. Then, his most serious offense, he ducked between two houses on Elm Street. Theo heard someone yelling from the porch behind him until he was safely into an alley that ran into the teacher's parking lot behind the school. He checked his watch. 9 minutes. Not bad. He parked the rack by the flagpole, secured his bike with a chain, then entered with a flood of kids who had just stepped off a bus. The 8:40 bell was ringing when he walked into his homeroom and said good morning to Mr. Mount, who not only taught him government, but was his advisor as well. Talk to Judge Gantry, Theo said at the teacher's desk, one considerably small than the one he'd just left in the courthouse. The room was buzzing with the usual early morning chaos. All 16 boys were present, and all appeared to be involved in some sort of gag, scuffle, joke, or shoving match. And got the seats, first thing in the morning. Excellent. Great job, Theo. Mr. Mount eventually restored order, called the roll, made his announcement, and 10 minutes later sent the boys down the hall to their first period Spanish class with Madame Monique. There was some awkward flirting between the rooms, and as the boys mixed with the girls. During classes, they were gender separated, according to a new policy adopted by the smart people in charge of educating all children in town. The genders are free to mingle at all other times. Madame Monique was a tall, dark lady from Cameroon in West Africa. She had moved to Strattenburg 3 years earlier when her husband, also from Cameroon, took a job at the local college where he taught languages. She was not the typical teacher at the middle school, far from it. As a child in Africa, she had grown up speaking Beti, her tribal dialect, as well as French and English, the official languages of Cameroon. Her father was a doctor and thus could afford to send her to school in Switzerland, where she picked up German and Italian. Her Spanish had been perfected when she went to college in Madrid. She is currently working on her Russian with plans to move to Mandarin Chinese. Her classroom was filled with large, colorful maps of the world, and her students believed she had been everywhere, seen everything, and could speak any language. It's a big world, she told them many times, and most people in other countries speak more than one language. While the students concentrated on Spanish, they were also encouraged to explore others. Theo's mother had been studying Spanish for 20 years, and as a preschooler, he had learned from her many of the basic words and phrases. Some of her clients were from Central America, and when Theo saw them at the office, he was ready to practice. They always thought they always thought it was cute. Madame Monique had told him that he had an ear for languages, and his this had inspired him to study harder. She was often asked by her curious students to say something in German or speak some Italian. She would, but first the student making the request had to stand and say a few words in that language. Bonus points were given, and this created enthusiasm. Most of the boys in Theo's class knew a few dozen words in several languages. Aaron, who had a Spanish mother and a German father, was by far the most talented linguist, but was determined to catch him. After government, Spanish was his favorite class, and Madame Monique ran a close second to Mr. Mount as his favorite teacher. Today, though, he had trouble concentrating. They were studying Spanish verbs, a tedious chore on a good day, and Theo's mind was elsewhere. He worried about April and her awful day at the witness stand. He couldn't imagine the horror of being forced to choose one parent over another. And when he managed to set April aside, he was consumed with the murder trial and couldn't wait until tomorrow to watch the opening statements by the lawyer. Most of his classmates dreamed of getting tickets to the big game or concert. Theo Boone lived for the big trials. Second period was geometry with Miss Garman. It was followed by a short break outdoors. Then the class returned to homeroom. To Mr. Mount, and to the best hour of the day, at least in Theo's opinion. Mr. Mount was in his mid 30s and had once worked as a lawyer in a gigantic firm in a skyscraper in Chicago. His brother was a lawyer. His father and grandfather had been lawyers and judges. Mr. Mount, though, had grown weary of the long hours and high pressure, and well, he'd quit. He'd walked away from the big money and found something he found far more rewarding. He loved teaching, and though he still thought of himself as a lawyer, he considered the classroom far more important than the courtroom. Because he knew the law so well, his government class spent most of the time discussing cases, old ones and current ones, and even fictitious ones on television. All right, men, he began when they were seated and still. He always addressed them as men, and for 14-year-olds, there was no greater compliment. Tomorrow I want you here at 8:15. We'll take a bus to the courthouse and we'll be in our seats in plenty of time. It's a field trip approved by the principal, so you'll be excused from all other classes. Bring lunch money and we'll eat at Pappy's Deli. Any questions? The men were hanging on every word, excitement over their faces. What about backpacks? Someone asked. No, Mr. Mount answered. You can't take anything into the courtroom. Security will be tight. It is, after all, the first murder trial we had here in a long time. Any more questions? What should we wear? Slowly, all eyes turned to Theo, including those of Mr. Mount. It was well known that Theo spent more time in the courthouse than most lawyers. Coat and tie, Theo? Mr. Mount asked. No, not at all. What we're wearing now is fine. Great. Any more questions? Good. Now I've asked Theo if he would sort of set the stage for tomorrow. Lay out the courtroom, give us all the players, tell us what we're in for, Theo. Theo's laptop was already wired to the overhead projector. He walked up he walked to the front of the class, pressed a key, and a large diagram appeared on the digital widescreen whiteboard. This is the main courtroom, Theo said in his best lawyer voice. He held a laser pointer with a red light and sort of waved it around the diagram. At the top in the center here is the bench. That's where the judge sits and controls the trial. Not sure why it's called a bench. It's more like a throne. But anyway, we'll stick with bench. The judge is Henry Gantry. He punched a key and a large formal photo of Judge Gantry appeared. Black robe, somber face. Theo shrank it, then dragged it up to the bench. With the judge in place, he continued. Judge Gantry has been a judge for about 20 years and handles only criminal cases. He runs a tight courtroom and is well liked by most of the lawyers. The laser pointer moved to the middle of the courtroom. This is the defense table where Mr. Duffy, the man accused of murder, will be seated. Theo punched a key and a black and white photo, one taken from a newspaper, appeared. This is Mr. Duffy, age 49. Used to be married to Miss Duffy, who is now deceased, and, as we all know, Mr. Duffy is accused of murdering her. He shrank the photo and moved it to the defense table. His lawyer is Clifford Nance, probably the top criminal defense lawyer in this part of the state. Nance appeared in color, wearing a dark suit and shifty smile. He had long curly gray hair. His photo was reduced and placed next to his client's. Next to the defense table is the prosecution's table. The lead prosecutor is Jack Hogan, who is also known as the district attorney, or DA. Hogan's photo appeared for a few seconds before it was reduced and placed to the table next to the defense. Where'd you find these photos? Someone asked. Each year, the Bar Association publishes a directory of all the lawyers and judges, Theo answered. Are you included? This brought a few light laughs. No, now there will be other lawyers and paralegals at both tables, prosecution and defense. This area is usually crowded. Over here, next to the defense, is the jury box. It has 14 chairs, 12 for jurors and 2 for the alternates. Most states will use 12-man juries, although different sizes are not unusual. Regardless of the number, the verdict has to be unanimous, at least in criminal cases. They pick alternates in case one of the 12 gets sick or excused or something. The jury was selected last week, so we won't have to watch. So we don't have to watch that. It's pretty boring. The laser pointed the laser pointer moved to a spot in front of the bench. Theo continued. The court reporter sits here. So I have a machine that is called a stenograph, sort of like a typewriter, but much different. Her job is to record every word that is said during the trial. That might sound impossible, but she makes it look easy. Later, she'll prepare what's known as a transcript, so the lawyers and the judge will have a record of everything. Some transcripts have thousands of pages. The laser pointer moved again. Here, close to the court reporter and just down from the judge, is the witness chair. Each witness walks up here, is sworn to tell the truth, then takes a seat. Where do we sit? The laser pointer moved to the middle of the diagram. This is called the bar. Again, don't ask why. The bar is a wooden railing that separates the spectators from the trial area. There are 10 rows of seats with an aisle down the middle. This is usually more than enough for the crowd, but this trial will be different. The laser pointer moved to the rear of the courtroom. Up here, above the last few rows, is the balcony where there are 3 long benches. We're in the balcony, but don't worry. We'll be able to see and hear everything. Any questions? Mr. Mount asked. The boys gawked at the diagram. Who goes first? Someone asked. Theo began pacing. Well, the state has the burden of proving guilt, so it must present its case first. First thing, tomorrow morning, the prosecutor will walk to the jury box and address the jurors. This is called the opening statement. He'll lay out his case. Then the defense lawyer will do the same. After that, the state will start calling witnesses. As you know, Mr. Duffy is presumed to be innocent, so the state must prove him guilty, and it must do so beyond a reasonable doubt. He claims that he's innocent, which actually in real life doesn't apply very often. About 80% of those indicted for a murder eventually plead guilty because they are in fact guilty. The other 20% go to trial, and 90% of those are found guilty. So it's rare for a murder defendant to be found not guilty. My dad thinks he's guilty, Brian said. A lot of people do, Theo said. How many trials have you watched, Theo? I don't know, dozens. Since none of the other 15 have ever seen the inside of a courtroom, this is almost beyond belief. Theo continued, for those of you who watch a lot of television, don't expect fireworks. A real trial is very different and not nearly as exciting. There are no surprise witnesses, no dramatic confessions, no fistfights between the lawyers, and in this trial, there are no eyewitnesses to a murder. This means all the evidence from the state will be circumstantial. You'll hear this word a lot, especially from Mr. Clifford Nance, the defense lawyer. He'll make a big deal out of the fact that the state has no direct proof, that everything is circumstantial. I'm not sure what that means, someone said. It means that the evidence is indirect, not direct. For example, did you ride your bike to school? Yes. And did you chain it to the rack by the flagpole? Yes. So when you leave school this afternoon and you go to the rack and your bike is gone and the chain has been cut, then you have indirect evidence that someone stole your bike. No one saw the thief, so there's no direct evidence. And let's say that tomorrow the police find your bike in the pawn shop on Raleigh Street. a place known to deal in stolen bikes. The owner gives the police a name. They investigate and find some dude with a history of stealing bikes. You can then make a strong case, though indirect evidence, that this guy is your thief. No direct evidence, but circumstantial. Even Mr. Mount was nodding along. He was the faculty advisor for the eighth grade debate team, and not surprisingly, Theodore Boone was a star. He had never had a student as quick on his feet. "Thank you, Theo," Mr. Mount said, "and thank you for getting us the seats in this morning." "Nothing to it," Theo said, and proudly took his seat. It was a bright class in a strong public school. Justin was by far the best athlete, though he couldn't swim as fast as Brian. Ricardo beat them all at golf and tennis. Edward played the cello, Woody the electric guitar, Darren the drums, Jarvis the trumpet. Joey had the highest IQ and made perfect grades. Chase was the mad scientist who was always a threat to blow up the lab. Aaron spoke Spanish from his mother's side, German from his father's, and English, of course. Brandon had an early morning route, traded stocks online, and planned to be the first millionaire in the group. Naturally, there were two hopeless nerds and at least one potential felon. The class even had its own lawyer, a first, for Mr. Mount. And that's the end of chapter 2.